Did Nero really watch Rome burn? The dark truth. Picture this. Rome is engulfed in flames. The greatest city in the ancient world is burning to the ground. And somewhere, high above the chaos, Emperor Nero sits with his lyre, playing music while his empire crumbles. This is one of history's most enduring images of tyrannical indifference. But is it true? Today, we're diving deep into one of history's most persistent myths to uncover the dark truth about Nero and the Great Fire of Rome. The year was 64 C. Rome was the beating heart of the largest empire the world had ever seen. With over 1 million inhabitants crammed into a city that had grown far beyond its original boundaries, Rome was a tinderbox waiting for a spark. The streets were narrow and winding, packed with wooden buildings that rose several stories high. The poor lived in cramped apartment blocks called insulae, while shops and taverns crowded the ground floors. On the night of July 18th, disaster struck. A fire began in the Circus Maximus, Rome's massive chariot racing stadium. What started as perhaps a small blaze quickly spread through the merchant stalls and wooden seating. Within hours, the fire had escaped the circus and was devouring entire neighborhoods. The fire raged for 6 days and 7 nights. Ancient sources describe scenes of absolute terror. Families fled through smoke-filled streets, clutching whatever possessions they could carry. The narrow alleyways became death traps as people trampled each other in their desperate attempts to escape. The fire was so intense that it jumped across streets and even the Tiber River. By the time the flames were finally extinguished, 3 of Rome's 14 districts had been completely destroyed, and 7 more were severely damaged. Countless lives were lost, though exact numbers remain unknown. Priceless temples, libraries, and monuments that had stood for centuries were reduced to ash and rubble. The economic and cultural devastation was beyond comprehension. Here's where the story gets interesting. According to popular legend, Nero was in Rome during the fire, callously playing his lyre and singing about the destruction of Troy while his city burned. Some versions even claim he started the fire himself to clear land for his grandiose building projects. But what do the historical sources actually tell us? The most reliable ancient historians paint a very different picture. Tacitus, one of Rome's greatest historians who lived through this period, tells us something remarkable. Nero wasn't even in Rome when the fire started. The emperor was actually 35 miles away in Antium, his birthplace and favorite retreat. When news of the disaster reached him, Nero immediately rushed back to Rome. Rather than standing idly by with a musical instrument, he threw himself into relief efforts with surprising energy and effectiveness. What Nero did next challenges everything we think we know about him. He opened his own palaces and public buildings to house the thousands of homeless refugees. He organized massive relief efforts, importing grain from nearby regions to feed the displaced population. He even paid for temporary shelters to be constructed. But Nero's response went beyond immediate relief. He implemented new building codes designed to prevent future catastrophes. Streets were widened, building heights were limited, and certain types of construction materials were banned. He required that buildings have proper spacing between them and mandated the use of fire-resistant stone and brick instead of wood. These weren't the actions of a man who had gleefully watched his city burn. They were the desperate measures of an emperor trying to save his reign and his people. So how did the myth of Nero fiddling while Rome burned become so entrenched in our collective memory? The answer lies in ancient politics and propaganda. Nero had many enemies, both during his lifetime and after his death. Political opponents and later historians had every incentive to portray him as a monster. The story gained traction because it perfectly encapsulated everything people wanted to believe about Nero's character. He was already seen as vain, cruel, and obsessed with artistic pursuits that his critics deemed unworthy of an emperor. The image of him playing music while Rome burned was too perfect a metaphor to resist. It's also worth noting that the lyre, not the fiddle, was Nero's instrument of choice. Fiddles wouldn't be invented for another 1,000 years. But fiddling while Rome burned has a much better ring to it than lyring while Rome burned. However, there's another dark twist to this story. While Nero probably didn't start the fire deliberately, some ancient sources suggest he may have taken advantage of the disaster for his own purposes. After the fire, Nero began construction of his massive golden house, a sprawling palace complex that covered roughly 300 acres of prime Roman real estate. Critics argued that Nero had always wanted this land, but couldn't acquire it while the neighborhood stood intact. The fire, whether started intentionally or not, gave him the perfect opportunity to seize vast areas of the city center for his personal use. This fueled rumors that while he didn't fiddle during the fire, he certainly benefited from it afterward. The truth about Nero is far more complex than either the myth of the evil emperor or the counter-narrative of the heroic leader. He was a deeply flawed ruler who combined genuine administrative competence with dangerous narcissism and cruelty. His relief efforts during the fire were real and effective, but so was his exploitation of the disaster for personal gain. Nero's reign was marked by artistic pretensions, political murders, and increasingly erratic behavior. He killed his own mother and 2 wives, among others. He performed on stage, something Romans considered beneath the dignity of an emperor. His later years were marked by paranoia and excess that eventually led to his downfall. The story of Nero and the Great Fire teaches us something crucial about how historical myths are created and preserved. When a story fits our preconceptions perfectly, we rarely question its accuracy. The image of Nero fiddling while Rome burned has endured not because it's true, but because it tells us what we want to believe about power, responsibility, and the consequences of poor leadership. In our modern world, where misinformation spreads faster than ever, the Nero myth serves as a perfect reminder to question dramatic stories that seem too convenient to be true. The real story is usually more complicated, more nuanced, and ultimately more human than the legend. Did Nero really watch Rome burn? No, he didn't. He wasn't even there when it started, and when he returned, he worked tirelessly to help his people. But did he exploit the tragedy for his own benefit? Almost certainly. The dark truth isn't that Nero was a cartoon villain gleefully destroying his own city. It's that he was something far more dangerous and far more human. A flawed leader who combined genuine capability with selfish ambition and moral blindness. The real Nero reminds us that history's villains are rarely as simple as we'd like them to be. And sometimes, that makes them far more terrifying than any myth ever could.